Kunjokwa, Sego, Skanagoa. Welcome to the Faculty of Education on the Fort Garry campus of the University of Manitoba here on Treaty 1 territory, also the traditional territories of the Red River Métis. The University of Manitoba's Faculty of Education has been on a journey for the last little while attempting to improve the manner through which they address Indigenous engagement and achievement. We have developed new programming. We have ventured to improve the manner with which we interface with communities, and we are now on a journey towards improved graduate level programming for our students. In this journey, we have had opportunities to engage with scholars from Manitoba and elsewhere across Turtle Island. I welcome you to tonight's event in which we will do just that. We've had a number of very learned faculty who called our Faculty of Education home and have contributed to the discourses and programs of our faculty. And they have contributed in a positive way from which not only our students have learned and benefited from, but also our communities and also us as colleagues. I'm going to take this opportunity to acknowledge a faculty member who recently passed away, but was a major contributor to our faculty education and to Indigenous education in the province of Manitoba. Karen Favell was an assistant professor in our Department of Educational Administration, Foundations, and Psychology. She came to us as what we call an ABD, and then was eventually promoted to the rank of assistant professor. And she contributed in some very powerful ways to the climate and culture of our faculty. I hope you'll join me in a moment of silent reflection in memorial of Karen Favell. Nyaogo, thank you very much. Karen and others' contributions to this faculty over the last little while has built to a point where we are confident that the future will be bright for all members of the Faculty of Education community and that of the province of Manitoba, especially in the areas of primary, secondary, post-secondary, and higher education. There's no time here for me to summarize all that we have done over the last few years, but we have submitted recently our Faculty of Education Reconciliation Action Plan, and here is an image of the new Indigenous community space on the third floor of our faculty, one of the projects to which Karen Favell and others contributed to, and it's in her memory that I move forward with my work in this faculty and in this province. It's at this time, given the topic that we're exploring here tonight and the guests that we have lecturing, that I invite Elder Murdoch to come and join us to open this session in a traditional way.
Tansy. My name is Nikan Iskamiski Squel. In the Cree language, that means leading earth woman. I want to honor this tobacco that was passed to me from Professor Frank Deere, and to carry this into ceremony and what we're going to be listening to this evening. So I put the tobacco tie and I'm going to smudge it. I'm going to smudge it so that way it brings good energy into these studies tonight, listening about what's going to be taking place. I also want to thank the creator for giving us this opportunity to do these sessions through Zoom because of what's been happening over the last few years, COVID. And I want to thank Creator for each and every one of you that's here tonight to take part in these sessions. I also want to thank Creator to give us good thoughts, to allow our ears to hear good things, to allow our minds to carry through in what we're going to be listening to today. And I wanted to say this as part of my teaching along the way, carrying women's teachings on the TP. And there's a poem here that I would like to share with you. And it's about kinship. And this is part of our history, our culture, our ethnic background. I am home now. Come on in, my friend. I have a fire burning to warm your heads and your hands. Come on in, my elders. You have all my respect. Another day has passed. Rest here if you're tired. Come on in, my sisters. Bring your little ones. Eat my fried bread. I had made it for you. It will bring you strength for this beautiful child. Come on in, my brother. Your moccasins are worn. Here, have mine. So you can just continue on with your journey. Do not let the poisons pull you from your path. My people, come on in. Let us talk and smoke together. For all, forever, you are welcome into my teepee. I just want to thank Creator for these beautiful poems that our Indigenous people had written over the years. And so thankful for being a part and taking part in this, as sitting here as an elder. And I want to thank Creator for all of you that you continue to walk your path on your journey that Creator has provided for you. I want to thank grandmothers and grandfathers that give us the knowledge and the wisdom to move forward, to give us that strength and understanding about our history, about our culture, our ethnic background, and our languages. With that being said, I wanted to say, Iwasani. Thank you.
Now, Elder Wanda, your contribution to our event is much appreciated. And it's the way that we open events such as this, how we engage with ceremony, that's really important to us. It sets the stage for what's to follow, and it situates us in the mindset that's necessary in order to engage with the content that we're going to be exploring tonight. It's a great pleasure to introduce our lecturer tonight. Jennifer Brant belongs to Mohawk Nation with family ties to 6 nations on the Grand River Territory and Tyendinaga, Mohawk Territory. Jennifer completed her PhD in education at Brock University, recently taught in the faculty education here in the University of Manitoba, and is currently an assistant professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Jennifer's dissertation, entitled Journeying Toward a Praxis of Indigenous Maternal Pedagogy, Lessons from Our Sweetgrass Baskets, provides insight into the value of a unique pedagogical approach as it relates to cultural identity development and academic success. Her work positions Indigenous literatures as educational tools to move students beyond passive empathy and compassion, inspire healing and wellness, and foster socio-political action. Jennifer is the co-editor for Forever Loved, Exposing the Hidden Crisis of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada, and writes to call for an immediate and effective response to racialized and sexualized violence. Through her community work, teaching, research, and writing, Jennifer is dedicated to encouraging teacher candidates to engage in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action, and the 231 calls for justice released in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Tonight's lecture is titled Indigenous Maternal Methodologies, Ethical and Relational Responsibilities. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Brant. Nyawa.
Sego, Sewaguego. Welcome everyone, my name is Jennifer Brant and I'm really honored to be here. And I wanted to acknowledge and thank Dr. Frank Deere for the invitation, also for the acknowledgement of one of my dear colleagues, Dr. Karen Favel. We started at the University of Manitoba at the same time. My last visit here, we had dinner. We used to have lunch in the staff room, and I was really honored to be able to participate, be able to attend her dissertation by Zoom. And I know that Karen lives on through the faculty, so just wanted to acknowledge that. So this image is of my children at Lakehead University in the summer of 2012. I share this image because it was indeed a lifetime of lived experiences as an Indigenous person in mainstream education, along with experiences teaching Indigenous studies courses in teacher education that offers the prologue for the work that I do today. The picture is of my children who traveled with me to Lakehead University in the summer of 2012 when I completed my second summer in residence as part of my PhD program. They also came with me to my summer in residence in Windsor in 2011, and my youngest has came along to various CSSC conferences across Canada. In 2018, we moved here to Winnipeg for my first faculty position and found new landscapes. And so in each of these spaces, they've connected to land and to water, and you can see them physically putting their hands in the water. So it's really important that I honor and talk about my personal ties to the work that I do as an Indigenous scholar. It's also important that I begin by grounding myself as a Haudenosaunee woman, an ISTA or mother scholar, and it is from this place of knowing and being that my work begins, and that I see myself on an intentional and ongoing learning journey. It's important that I'm always thinking deeply about my personal ties to research, my intentions to do good work that benefits Indigenous communities. So I'm always thinking about what are my responsibilities and how do I honor these personal ties? My research always starts with place and being. As I showcased in the last two slides, it's rooted in both my cultural identity and commitments to Indigenous well-being. This is not an easy task. It's not easy to do the kind of work in these spaces that weren't designed for Indigenous scholarship, right? And so I'm talking about mainstream institutions. And so I carry these words with me, this quotation here, that your relationship to your research topic is your own. It springs from a lifetime of distinctiveness and uniqueness only you have history with. Be encouraged by this. Do not doubt your own capacity to scaffold complex and cultural ways in which to describe the world. In 2014, I attended the WIPSE conference, the World Indigenous Peoples Conference in Education in Hawaii, and this conference experience was life-changing for me. Manulani Louis Mayer was one of the keynote speakers at the conference, and the picture that I have on the bottom of the screen is actually from one of the Cultural Day events, where a group of youth sang us into the territory and took us on a tour of the gardens where they have a land-based education program. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my entry point into Indigenous feminism. Of course, I've mentioned this begins from my own positionality as a Haudenosaunee woman and mother scholar who theorizes about Indigenous maternal pedagogies as liberatory praxis. My work has centered on racialized, sexualized, and gender-based violences, as well as carving out spaces for activist practices in academia. But I learned feminism outside of the academy. My aunt was deeply involved in the Native Women's Association of Canada, and some of my earliest memories are of sitting in boardrooms or going outside to hold ceremony. I was a young girl when the 1990 Oka crisis was happening near the Mohawk communities of Kanesatake and Ganawage. The Oka crisis occurred over a land claim dispute in Oka, Quebec, in protest against a golf course expansion over Mohawk burial grounds. And so as a young girl and member of a matrilineal community, I understood women's involvement on the front lines and the need for the community to support our land defenders. It's important to acknowledge and to recognize that the Oka crisis happened during a time before social media, and yet the national coverage of this event and the solidarity that was happening, the ceremonies that were happening across Turtle Island was really powerful during this 78-day standoff. As an undergrad student, I was predominantly taught white feminism, and for some time I started to reject feminism altogether. I could not see the value that it held for Indigenous women. I was in my third year of university when one of the assigned readings was authored by the late Patricia Montour Angus. And this was the first time in my entire educational experience when an assigned reading was authored by an Indigenous person. And of course, this was a woman who was Mohawk as well, right? And so I could see myself in the work. Around the same time, a friend who was studying with Lee Maracle opened my eyes to the world of Indigenous feminist scholarship. So finally, I started to see a place for myself within feminism. I remember the feeling of reading Montour Angus's Thunder in My Soul, A Mohawk Woman Speaks, and Maracle's I Am Woman, A Native Perspective on Feminism and Sociology. These two books opened my heart to a world of scholarship that I didn't know existed. And for the first time, I could see my own experiences reflected. There is a clear distinction between between work that is written about Indigenous women versus work that is written by Indigenous women. Montour Angus's and Maracle's words were not only affirming, but they also documented the ways Indigenous women have been silenced in academia. Their words moved me in ways that indeed fuel the work that I do today. Written into their work was the kind of uprising that I learned about in community, right? Going back to my earlier experiences learning about feminism. Indigenous women's scholarship documents the vulnerabilities, the violences, and the ways Indigenous women have always resisted white supremacy. The words also give Indigenous students space to breathe and ultimately to imagine Indigenous futurities and community well-being. Sorry, my voice is a little bit shaky. So while my journey toward learning about feminism was complicated, my activist roots are indeed intergenerational and come from a legacy of Indigenous women. So pictured here is my grandmother, Eleanor May Davis Brant. She was a residential school survivor, and she single-handedly raised 9 children while completing a nursing degree. My grandmother modeled the importance of education, and in her own way, she taught me about the role of feminism as an intergenerational labor of love. Today, as I extend the work of Indigenous literatures in my own feminist praxis, I am honored to carry and teach from the same physical copies of some of the books my grandmother read. And so here she's holding a copy of Flint and Feather, which I have today. So few Indigenous women were publishing in 1981. Sorry, this is a quotation from Lee Maracle. When Beth Brant came forward with her first work. In those days, the few of us that were writing were so hungry for each other's work that we snapped her up. She transformed us. So Lee Maracle refers to Beth Brant's poetry And some of her grounding work is in A Gathering of Spirit, which was originally released in 1984, reprinted in 1988. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about an anthology dedicated to the memory of Beth Brant, A Generous Spirit. So in A Gathering of Spirit, Beth Brant writes a long story, which actually isn't really a long story. It's a fairly short story, but it's called A Long Story. And she documents the interference into Indigenous women's homes and into Indigenous women's roles as mothers in this story by providing two different timelines. And so in one timeline, a woman has her children taken away by Indian agents and placed into residential schools. And in the second timeline, a lesbian mother has her children taken away by Children's Aid Society. And so Beth Brant here is documenting and challenging patriarchy and heteronormativity and the interference that it's had within Indigenous families. So she's going through two different timelines. I often think about if there was a third timeline, if we talked about what that third timeline would be today, what that would look like. So Indigenous children, of course, we know continue to be pulled from Indigenous families and placed into non-Indigenous homes. Beth Brant wrote about this, and expresses the rawness that one can only imagine, the despair of your child being removed from your family and the effect that that has on cultural identity. So I also wanted to share these very profound words that are written in A Generous Spirit by Deborah Miranda. She says, Beth Brant helped saved my life. I never met Beth Brant. Both of these things are true. And then she writes, inside the heating vents of the little back room I use as an office, I hide Beth Brant's books, but carry her stories filled with protection against depression and despair inside the small leather pouch that is my heart. No, I never met Beth Brant, but I hung on to her stories even as my life frayed like a rope bearing too much weight. Beth Brant's stories were the strands that strengthened my own torn fibers. Beth Brant's words still give me the courage to face my own encounters with beings much like salmon or eagle, powerful beings whose knowledge of the larger cycles and spirals of existence teach us about responsibilities, bestow the skills and strength we need to make meaningful Indigenous lives. And so that's from Deborah Miranda. And I'm not related to Beth Brant that I know of, but Beth Brant is also from Tyendinaga, and over half of the band office in Tyendinaga has the last name Brant. So it's a very popular last name. So just sharing a lot about how I position myself as an Indigenous scholar, but I also want to bring it back to the words of Linda Tawai-Smith. And so as a child, I knew I wanted to be a teacher as a child, but I was also amazed by the idea of research. And I carried this amazement into my undergrad studies. And so I was so excited about applying to become a research assistant. I believe that this initial sort of amazement about research had to do with hearing conversations about research and program development at the local Indigenous Friendship Center, where I spent most of my childhood, or at youth and elders conferences I attended. But of course this was before I gained an in-depth understanding about what research meant for Indigenous communities. And so my naive understanding of research shifted once I delved into Indigenous scholarship, and more so towards the end of my undergrad studies and in grad studies. And so I was just starting my grad studies when I came across Linda Tawai-Smith's book. I was enthralled when I first read Decolonizing Methodologies. Still am. So the version that I picked up one day while browsing the university bookstore is still full of colored Post-it notes, and it kind of moves from my bookshelf to my desk and back to my bookshelf. And now I have her latest 2021 version of this. And so this quotation here, often quoted quotation, from the vantage point of the colonized, a position from which I write and choose to privilege, The term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. And so it's really important to me that I use research and engage in research in a way that it is an honorable word. And so inspired by the work of Linda Twai-Smith, Joanne Archibald, and others who I will reference throughout the presentation, I remain committed to engaging in research that is done with and for Indigenous communities. And it is within this broader context that my research can be understood as an extension of Indigenous community well-being, cultural safety, and ethical responsibilities. So it's important then for me to understand that research is inherently political. The education system, as Marie-Baptiste reminds us, continues to serve as a cultural manifestation of society that is hegemonically distributed within race, class, and gendered systems. Research is fraught in its complicity with power, right? And so it's important for me as an Indigenous scholar to understand that and to think about what it means to carve out new tools and new methodologies. So in the prologue to the second edition of Indigenous Methodologies, Characteristics, Conversations, and Contexts, Margaret Kovach stated that in 2003, she was on this quest for Indigenous methodologies. And I was reading her work when I was on my own quest as a doctoral student. So this really resonates with me. She said that I start taking research methodology courses, and I'm not able to understand why research textbooks do not offer Indigenous frameworks as a methodological option for research. I cannot leave this alone. It is a curiosity that I cannot abandon. I want to know about the intersectionality between Indigenous knowledges and research. I switch my topic. And so this resonates with me because I switched my research methodology several times before I delved into her work. So in my dissertation, I expressed my quest for an Indigenous research framework that would align with Indigenous research principles and best capture the collective research story of my participants. So before I get into a description of what that looks like, I wanted to share some guidelines and protocols. And so these come from Margaret Kovach's work, and she talks about some of the characteristics and contexts of Indigenous methodologies. That upholding Indigenous methodologies is about Indigenous cultural sustainability, that Indigenous methodologies have a social justice imperative. She talks a little bit about the research policy practice cycle. And so indeed, policies that affect Indigenous peoples from our research are important to unpack. So when we consider things like the research process that was involved in the national public inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit peoples, we can see how concrete examples of how a research process affects policy. And perhaps in many ways, we're still waiting to see the responses to the 231 calls for justice that came out of the final report of this inquiry. But the point that I'm trying to get across is that process, the story gathering process, and the way in which we gather a research story must be intentional, right? Especially if it affects policy and practice, and the policies and practices that will contribute to Indigenous community well-being. And of course, Indigenous methodologies must be ethical, and they must involve relational accountability. So Margaret Kovach also reminds us that community engagement is the heartbeat of Indigenous research. It involves genuine relationship building instead of another box to be checked. So when we think about our SSHRC applications, our research ethics protocols, what does it mean to build genuine relationships versus just checking that box? Indigenous community engagement is marked by the reverberations of colonial trauma. And so it takes time to develop those relationships, and we need to understand the reverberations of colonial trauma that affect that, right? So what are some of the hesitancies? What is the work, and how long does it take to engage and foster those relationships? And are those relationships complete when the research is complete, right? So thinking about knowledge dissemination, what do you do with the research? And finally, a quotation from Margaret Kovach that I'm still sitting with that I think is really profound. Given the omnipresence of colonial history amid conscious and unconscious bias, creating a trusting Indigenous community researcher partnership requires the relational attentivity and skill to sustain itself when trickster appears. And so, as I said, I'm still sitting with this, right? This is an important quotation that I think about in my own work. And so, who's trickster appearing in the research process? Is it those timelines that go against the relational accountability protocols? Is it the things that require us to check off the box, right? And so these are things that I need to continuously be intentional about. For my own study, it also involved, what does it look like to enact sharing circles during a pandemic, right? And so what did it mean to pause the research when it was time to pause the research, and what did it mean to continue the research when it was time to do so? And when I say time to do so, that's when it was good for the well-being of the participants. So some of the theoretical frameworks, I'm going to talk a little bit, moving from methodologies to pedagogies and then back to methodologies again, I'll explain why. But some of the theoretical frameworks of my work on Indigenous maternal pedagogies involve ancestral knowledges, what I've been referring to as maternal essence. As a Haudenosaunee person, I understand the word matriarchal and maternal in very different ways than heteronormative and patriarchal understandings of such words. But for today, I'm going to talk about ancestral knowledges, which I find in Indigenous women's literature and serves as a spiritual and physical legacy that promotes strength and resilience. Dr. Kim Anderson talks about this in terms of digging up story medicine. I also draw on the work of the late Bell Hooks and her work on home place. I've been theorizing about Indigenous perspectives of a home place. And so Bell Hooks was writing Home Place within the context of racist and sexist and what she refers to as white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And she talks about home place as this space in the home where Black women created a safe space of resistance and renewal in sort of response to what was happening outside of the home. And so in honor of her work, I've also been thinking about the ways Indigenous women have had to create those safe spaces in relation to the removal of children from the home and in relation to, in response to the racism and sexism that Indigenous peoples have faced. I connect this as well to the work of legal scholar Willie Ermine on the ethical space of engagement. And so this is defined as a space where disparate worldviews come together through ethical dialogue. Am I okay for time? Okay. And then finally, cultural identity theory by drawing on Kim Anderson's work. So I could spend an entire session talking about each of these, right? And so I'm just kind of introducing some of the theoretical frameworks. So gathering the stories, right, bringing it back to methodology, and I'll talk a bit about the connection between pedagogy and methodology. The methodological and pedagogical links connecting my teaching and research are affirmed by Dolores Delgado Bernal, who explained, none of the three, epistemology, methodology, and pedagogy, can be isolated from one another, as they are closely interdependent and directly influence the research process. The connections between methodological and pedagogical insights come together through, in the words of Dolores Delgado Bernal, the braiding of theory, qualitative research strategies, and a socio-political consciousness. This stands and offers an important lens to view the critical and justice-oriented nature of my work. So I want to talk a little bit, the next couple slides are about Indigenous maternal methodologies, but I define this as an Indigenous women-centered methodology. And I want to talk a little bit about the work that inspires this. So I'll start with the work of Dr. Lara Fitzner, who is a faculty member here at U of M for quite some time. And so her work revealed the importance of narrative as a research framework for understanding the lived realities of Indigenous participants. Her work demonstrates how storytelling as research methodology is intertwined with identity work. And she wrote, "We learn how individuals construct their identities and the conception of what community is from their stories." So I connect with this work in relation to Indigenous maternal pedagogy, even more so as she describes this data gathering process through storytelling narratives. And so she writes that the storytelling narratives delve into the intersecting experiences of Indigenous women's lives. And they're interrelated to the kind of stories I bring it back to pedagogy in my classroom through Indigenous women's literatures. So much like the stories that I share in my courses, her description of storytelling that includes difficult stories, ensuring a true reflection of the array of Indigenous realities. And so as she wrote, "I have come to understand that the process of translating meanings and relevance embedded in our autobiographical stories and narratives into themes, issues, and models can provoke a range of emotions, from anxiety to dynamic living. Indigenous scholars who favor a writing style that often includes our contentious and traumatic histories with colonization and assimilation, in addition to culturally specific stories, epistemologies, and metaphors, are gaining credibility, and these writings add to the various forms of scholarly publications." And so it's really important here to note that she's talking about a balance of both. She's also talking about fostering joy and desired-based stories in the research process. So a big part of Indigenous maternal methodology, in relation to the pedagogy, because they go hand in hand, is really about transforming the research landscape. And so using material that helps participants to share their story. So this involves sharing circle methodology, and I'm going to talk more about Indigenous story work as well, but the gathering of voices that contribute to changing Indigenous landscape. And so I kind of think about what does it mean to sort of change the tools. I've been thinking deeply about Audre Lorde's well-known quote about the tools will never dismantle the master's house. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. An Indigenous scholar, Christopher Dunbar, also talks about, well, what does it mean to reimagine these tools? And so I think sharing circle, gathering processes is a different tool to gather the kind of stories that will transform university landscapes. So in my current study, I use sharing circle methodology, and this involves having elders or traditional knowledge keepers provide the ceremonial context of those sharing circles. And one of those sharing circles was held here in the space that the new Indigenous space, fairly new. So Dr. Frank Deere had showed an image of that space earlier. One of the comments that students share is that this sharing circle process offers them time to be together, to sit with an elder, and to contribute to a changing landscape for Indigenous students in teacher education. So this is in contrast to a focus group per se, but I resist comparing a sharing circle to a focus group because they are inherently different, and the sharing circle opens participants up to being empowered to share together a collective and powerful story, and knowing that they're going to participate in changing the university landscape that will benefit the coming generations of Indigenous students. Can I just do a time check? 3 minutes? Okay. So I'm going to skip over the next 2 slides, but very inspired by Joanne Archibald's work on Indigenous story work. And just some inspirations for ethical and relational responsibilities of enacting Indigenous research in educational settings. So I talked about the importance of working with elders and traditional knowledge keepers, the sharing circles. I talked about the space, and so in my doctoral research, it was also moving from an academic space to an outdoor space referred to as the Pines. And I'll talk a little bit about this slide. So in my thesis group, I get them to I bring all of the students that I'm supervising together and get them to do their 2-minute elevator pitch of their research. But I recently came across this tweet by Django Paris, and he talks about the importance of sort of reframing our 2-minute elevator pitch. And so thinking deeply about what does our research mean with these prompts. So I am learning in community with, so that together we can understand in order to contribute to. And so I get my students to think deeply about that, right, and to fill in the blanks there. And as another prompt, again, extending this tweet here, what does this mean if we imagine that our elevator pitch, we're in an elevator, right, filled with Indigenous folks, right? And so what does that mean, and how would we express the study that we're doing, right? And so part of this is ensuring that ethical relationality, right, and that our work is reciprocal and relates to Indigenous community well-being. Skip over this slide. I'm just going to skip over these slides in the interest of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about this one here. And so I recently did a research talk in my faculty, and we had to answer specific questions to prepare for the presentation. And so this question I wanted to share. So where is your field of study moving in the future, and what do you see as the most interesting lines of inquiry that students might consider to get involved as doctoral students? I wanted to share this. Some of you may know that I'm teaching an Indigenous methodology course in July, and so it might also give a sense of some of the conversations that we'll talk about. And so Indigenous Maternal Methodologies presents a unique and unfolding educational landscape as we carve out space for Indigenous epistemologies that are forward-thinking and nation-building. I bring in Indigenous literatures as story work, and you may have got the sense of that from my presentation so far. But one thing that I've been thinking about is archival research, and probably not, if some of you are familiar with archival research, this probably isn't the traditional definition, but really thinking about, and I have some images there, to share to go alongside that, but really thinking about archival research. And so I come from a matrilineal community. And when I think about archival research from that perspective, I think, what does it mean when a matrilineal community collides with a patriarchal worldview, right? And so we need to think about some of the voices that have been left out of the archive. So Marcy Rendon wrote about this, and she said, my own grandmothers have no names, that my own grandmothers and their heroic actions have been erased from history's page. And so what does it mean to go back into the archives or think about the archives from a decolonial feminist lens? And bringing it back full circle, I also have images of some of the books that I use, and these words from Beth Brant, that our hands live and work in the present while pushing on the past. It is impossible for us not to do both. Our hands make a future. And some of the things that I've been talking about, some of those themes are threaded throughout these books. And so they talk about kinship. They document in beautiful and powerful ways stories of both racialized, sexualized, and gender-based violence, giving a name to that violence, but also documenting survivance and the powerful stories of kinship and what it means to come together and protect one another. So as Lee Miracle once wrote, Turtle Island women had no reason to fear other humans, right? And so what does it mean to sort of imagine an otherwise society? So Nyawe Goa, thank you very much. Again, I welcome conversation and
Thank you very much, Jennifer. It was lovely to hear you talk, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I'm so thrilled that we have so many graduate students in the room tonight, and I do look forward to meeting you and putting faces to names. So thank you all for being here today. It's really lovely. So let's begin, and I think it would be great if we could have our first question or two from grad students, since they are guests here in our building as well tonight. And also, Dr. Deere will be watching the Zoom. So for those of you who are Zooming in, please use the Q&A function, and Dr. Deere will get your questions as well. So let's maybe just start off with a couple of the grad students. Any questions or comments?
First of all, thank you for this amazing presentation. I wonder, at first, if I do not have a mistake, you told you are talking about feminism, but I'm not sure if it was a kind of women-centered research. I mean, do you mean every research that is women-centered, for example, for indigenous society, indigenous community, it can be classified as feminism? I'm not sure about that. And the second one, I'm coming from Iran, in Asia, and it was amazing for me that we also have the same challenge for women in Iran. I mean, some challenges for those that are in minority in the society, and I think it's a kind of pattern, not limited to indigenous women, but to most of women in different parts of the world that are coming from minority part of society. Thank you so much.
thank you for that wonderful.
If I refer to the first part of my question, I want to be more clarified between feminism and women-centered research.
Okay, thank you. And can everyone hear me okay? I just want to make sure, okay. So I refer to myself as a decolonial feminist scholar. And so I think for me, I see the women-centered literatures that I draw on go hand in hand with my understandings of Indigenous feminism. And so there are different kinds of feminism, right? And so I'm specifically drawing on decolonial feminist theory. And part of that is also understanding, so I use the word maternal in my work a lot. I'm sort of starting to lean more toward the word kinship as well, but I come from a matrilineal community. And so understanding feminism from a society and a worldview that is both matrilineal and egalitarian is very different than mainstream understandings of the word maternal or patriarchal, right? And so when I use the word maternal from from my perspective, right, as a Haudenosaunee woman, it's different from the patriarchal heteronormative sense of what that word means, right? And so one can be maternal, it's not necessarily connected to the role of being a mother, right? And so there's space in there for queer understandings, understandings that disrupt, as I mentioned, like patriarchal heteronormativity. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, so it's really about unpacking sort of what can be referred to as white feminism, right? Offering more of a critical race feminist theory.
I think what's really wonderful about your work, can you hear me okay? Is that coming through okay? Yeah, thanks. I think what's really wonderful about your work, Jennifer, and I think what's inspirational, hopefully for graduate students in the room as well, is the ways in which you have really centered your own positionality, drawn on particular ontologies and epistemologies, and theorize that in such a way to come to new understandings of methodology. And I think this is what is the inspirational part for graduate students who we invite you to the university to take up this very thing, this kind of experimental, and that's not really the right word, but charting a very particular path that is reflective of very particular beliefs that you hold in regards to not just who you are, but who you are as a researcher. How did you come to that? How did you, maybe tell us a little bit more about your journey to those kinds of thinkings?
Sure. So I think, again, it goes back to the literature and what you had shared. I always start from my own identity, right? From my place, and I connect that. I talked about the late Patricia Montour Angus's work being the first work I read by an Indigenous author as an assigned, I read other Indigenous work, but as an assigned reading on my course syllabus, third year university, right? But there's a quote from Patricia Montour Angus, which she says that she can only speak and her only knowledge is from what she has experienced and from her cultural identity, right? And so I kind of take that forward into the work that I do, but also Margaret Kovach, who I talked about, and Dr. Kim Anderson, who I talked about, when they talk about what does it mean to start from a place of knowing and being, right? How do you understand the world by first coming from your own cultural identity? And that, again, like I talked about this as being evolving and ongoing and intentional. And in our community, we say, we're always learning. That's a lifelong journey. And so understanding cultural identity and being in your own sort of like way of understanding the world from your own place, I think is an ongoing lifelong journey.
And I think that's inspirational for researchers, right? So that we can let go of the way it's always been done and colonial and patriarchal ways of viewing research and really coming at it from new ways of thinking. I think that's so inspirational to think about possibilities within that instead of just being, using old school textbook methodologies, that there are other ways to approach it. I think that's very exciting. Yeah. Any other questions? Frank, do you have anything on the Zoom? Or should we take...
Is this on?
We should have switched spots. Eh?
What's that?
We should have switched spots so you could see.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
You can signal me when you say.
Yeah, take this off. Awesome. First, before I pose a question here, Yvonne just wants to say thank you for the great presentation, Jennifer. You have beautifully expressed such important concepts, and I love how you characterize maternal thinking. Well done. Jackie asks the following. I have completed my research for my master's thesis and used narrative inquiry as a methodology. The method I used was interviews, but used storytelling as a guiding principle. Using two-wide seeing to guide my educational leadership journey is important to me. However, I am a settler, my community is from England. I would love to hear from you in regards to a non-Indigenous person using sharing circles guided by elders and knowledge keepers and coming together in a cultural partnership.
So I thank you for that question. I think the key, and you've sort of answered that in your question as well, is the idea about community partnership. And so I think that for a non-Indigenous scholar to enact Indigenous research methodologies such as sharing circles, it has to be done with Indigenous community. It has to be led by Indigenous community. And so I think that, and again, really attending to that relationship building process with the community, asking yourself those important questions that I had posted from Django Paris's tweet, right? That, you know, what is the intention of this research? How is it giving back to community? Who are you doing the research for? So I think that those are some important questions that, and I think that you'll get different answers to that question. And the important part is that you're reflecting on those really important questions.
Go ahead, Sandy. Dr. Kurtzen?
Because I think I'm actually picking up on the concept. I think I'm really picking up on the same question. I did notice that throughout your talk you referenced Witsi as having changed your life, and talking about Meyer, who is Indigenous Hawaiian, and you referenced Linda Smith, who's Maori. And so I did notice that there were a number of Indigenous perspectives that were representative of outside Turtle Island. So therefore, the question is, how much, I'll speak louder. How much is maternal?
They can't hear you on the Zoom.
Okay. How much would you suggest that an Indigenous maternal pedagogy exists beyond? Like, is this an international connectivity, or are you just seeking resonances in other people's work that informs your work?
So that is an excellent question. Thank you. And I'm going to respond to this in a couple of ways. And so first, when I talk about Indigenous maternal methodologies, and I shared some of the scholars that I cited, like Linda Smith, I wouldn't define her work as an Indigenous maternal approach. However, in terms of like carving out spaces for Indigenous pedagogies and methodologies, I'm drawing on folks that have done that, right? Like she's critiquing mainstream colonial research, right? And so that's I can't leave that work out of my scholarship. You mentioned WIPSI, and so I wanted to share one of the things about that. So when I attended the WIPSI conference, there were beautiful, again, residences from across, like Indigenous peoples across the world, right? Which was really powerful, particularly on the Wednesday, they had a cultural day. And so when I say that conference was life-changing, I can't remember how many thousands were at that conference, but for that cultural day, for every nation represented to present their drum and their dance and their song, whether it was on stage or in the sort of like open arena space. So we had Haudenosaunee representation there, Haudenosaunee lacrosse players there. We had folks lead a round dance from this territory. But then we had Indigenous folks from Japan lead their style of a round dance. And like the just to see those connections was quite profound for me. And so when we talk about, I think that there are so many connections worldwide. But I also wanted to mention that at that conference, there were some younger Maori scholars that were also talking about revitalizing maternal knowledges. And so I saw really powerful connections to some of the work that I'm seeing done here in terms of revitalizing maternal knowledges. And I didn't like delve too much into that scholarship, but thinking about the work of scholars like Gaji Cook, who is a Mohawk midwife who has been working really hard to revitalize Indigenous midwifery and that work. And then the second part of your question is something that I actually wrote about in my, so for me, I'm documenting an Indigenous maternal methodology that enacts traditions that I understand, right, from my own cultural identity. For the sharing circles, I worked with both Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe elders, right? And when I did the sharing circles here in Winnipeg, I worked with Dr. Frank Deere and Dr. Jeannie Kerr, and they connected with local elders here. When I did the sharing circles in Lakehead, my colleague connected with elders there. And so the pedagogy, the Indigenous maternal methodology that I present isn't sort of like a recipe that you can just pick up and bring to another territory, another space. It involves the protocols that I talked about, connecting with land, territory, community, and the traditional knowledge keepers of that space. So it will look different in different territories.
But does nonetheless exist. I was just thinking about yarning and the yarning circle. Sorry. I was thinking about yarning and the yarning circles and so many of the other traditions that I have seen and seen practiced. So thank you.
Yeah. I actually recently, read and reviewed Sand Talk, where he talks about, yes. And so definitely those beautiful connections. So thank you for sharing.
Other questions? Yes, please.
So I was just wondering if you could provide some more details on the research methodology and if you describe it as a form of narrative inquiry or you think it's a different practice. And if you could explain more or provide some more details on the research questions that you would like to explore in your research.
Sure. So where do I start? So I think that storytelling methodology and sharing circle methodology by way of gathering story work is different than narrative inquiry. But of course there will be some connections. In my work I also drew on testimonial. So that answers the first part of your question. I know there was a second part, and I might be missing a part. Research questions, though. So the research that I'll talk a little bit about the research that I'm doing now, I guess. So the research that I'm doing now looks at the experiences, two different projects. So one, but they come together. So one on Indigenous experiences of reconciliatory efforts. So specifically, I'm looking at the mandatory Indigenous requirement courses in teacher ed, which people have looked at before, the effectiveness, how well does it respond to the TRC's calls to action, but I'm looking at it from an Indigenous perspective and specifically looking at it from the lens of how they foster Indigenous cultural safety. And that stems from my own experience teaching Indigenous requirement courses in teacher ed at several different institutions where it's predominantly a non-Indigenous space. And so there may be one or two Indigenous students in the classroom that go from being invisible in the class to suddenly, okay, now we're talking about residential schools. Now we're talking about and so how do we ensure that those conversations are being fostered in a way that attends to the ethical space of engagement that attends to Indigenous cultural safety? And then my other study now is looking at, in Ontario, we have a new First Voices course, and so the grade 11 English course has now become essentially an Indigenous course. So they're no longer reading Shakespeare, for example, but reading books like Indian Horse, reading books like Sherry Demelin's The Marrow Thieves. But it's English teachers that are teaching these courses, and so I'm looking at the pedagogical development, or the pedagogical sort of preparedness for teaching those courses, and drawing on work that suggests that teachers need to present a particular and intentional pedagogy and process to teaching Indigenous literatures, because if Indigenous literatures are not unpacked, they can be taught in a way that contributes to an ongoing colonial narrative.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the tricksters, and perhaps in providing some examples of how do they emerge, and when do you know, and then what do you do? So do you have any examples of when the tricksters emerge in research? I'm thinking about how tricky it is, but I also think that you mean it in a different way.
So when I shared that slide, I said, like, this is, I'm really drawn to that quotation, and to that, it's something that I'm continually, I'm getting tongue-tied here, reflecting on. And so I mentioned some examples of, academia. We have we're in a field where we have this publish or perish mindset, right? We apply to granting agencies, we require timelines, right? And so, as I mentioned, because of research being this dirty word for Indigenous communities, as Linda Twice-Smith reminds us, it takes time to foster relationships. And so in that sense, I'm sort of thinking, and I'm not sure if I'm misinterpreting what Margaret Kovach is intending there, but I'm thinking of this tendency to sort of check off the box, and to sort of adhere to these timelines at the expense of fostering ethical relations with Indigenous communities.
And I think about it too in the ways in which it must create tensions between the work that you're trying to do and maybe the work that's expected or required, whether it be university protocols or high school mandates or whatever that is, right? That there's those tensions between what you're aiming to do and then the expectations of whether it be the academy or the systems in which are colonial and patriarchal, right? So there must be that constant rub.
Yes, yes. There are a lot of tensions, right? And so I think that's why it's important for me, I started this presentation by saying I need to constantly be thinking about what my responsibility is as an Indigenous researcher.
Yeah, it's very apparent in the presentation too, the ways in which you're working through those ideas, yeah.
I think Frank might have a question.
Does it, is it, Frank?
Yes, okay, just waiting for my cue.
I got it.
Okay. So firstly, Jennifer, a student just mentioning how excited is to hear you speak, a PhD student at the U of M who's Haudenosaunee, specifically Mohawk, so Seg and Deborah. But one question here, thank you for your wonderful presentation and for sharing your work with us. I like the idea of Indigenous maternal methodologies becoming mainstream. What do you think that scholars like myself can do to support these? Do you find that there is a growing movement in many other educational institutions in Canada? For example, are there more universities that use these methodologies?
So that wasn't Deborah. So I just wanted to
no,
say,
that was somebody else.
Deborah, I look forward to meeting you this summer, perhaps. And for the other, thank you for this question. I'm not really sure how to approach this question. So one thing is I don't think, I think part of the question was the hope for these methodologies to become mainstream, and that's not the intention. So the intention isn't, and I don't perhaps I'm misinterpreting the question, but these methodologies, again, they're sacred and they're important, and this knowledge. So Kirkness and Barnhart talked about the 4 R's, and I'm probably going, off the top of my head, I don't have them written down, but Michelle Pigeon adds a 5th R, which is reverence. And part of that 5th R is that acknowledging that Indigenous knowledge rests with community. And so at the sharing circles that I enacted, there was ceremony that happened in those circles, but I didn't write about them. That ceremony was between the elder and the participant, and it wasn't my space to document that ceremony. And so when we think about reverence, and I think this is important sort of response to that question, it's important to understand that these methodologies are sacred. And so yes, they are important to carve out spaces that transform university for Indigenous peoples, right? So that they have spaces here, so that Indigenous knowledges and epistemologies are recognized on par with Western knowledges in mainstream institutions, but that doesn't mean that the sacredness of the methodology should be documented.
Yeah, and maybe this is, go ahead. I was going to say maybe this is a time to plug the course that Jennifer will be teaching here this summer. There's going to be an Indigenous Methodologies course this summer that Jennifer's teaching. I think there's a handful of spaces left. There's not very many, but it's open to U of M students. So for folks who are on Zoom and not from U of M, I'm sorry you can't come. But for those of you who are from our university and would like to hear more about Indigenous methodologies, that would be a really wonderful opportunity to be with Jennifer here on campus in person in July. So check it out.
So this is probably going to have to be the final question of the evening. And it's a departure from the research exercise, but I think it might merit some consideration. Could you speak a bit about how your work may inform embracing Indigenous ways of knowings in teacher education and K-12 schools?
Can you repeat? I missed the first part of that question, sorry.
Could you speak a bit about how your work may inform embracing Indigenous ways of knowing in teacher education and K-12 schools?
Okay. So probably not so much the methodology piece that I presented on, but indeed the pedagogical framework. I've been teaching, as I mentioned, the mandatory Indigenous requirement course in teacher ed for 5 years now, I guess, yes. In different, so here, as well at OISE in the Master of Teaching program there. And it's taken me some time, of course, like being reflexive of seeing what works, but it's taken me some time, I think, to really scaffold the learning in a way, because it's challenging for students to learn about anti-Indigenous racism and settler colonialism, right? And so a big component of that course is for them to unpack their own identities and positionalities. And so I think to answer, I'm going to kind of go back and forth here, but to answer the question of how that affects change in K-12, I think of like Dr. Alex Wilson's work on the rippling effect of well-being, and also Dr. Bettina Love's work when she talks about abolitionist pedagogies for one, but in a keynote she said she presents this kind of grace perhaps to her white students as a Black queer professor, with the intention that they will offer the same kind of grace when they become teachers to students that look like her. And I think that that's so powerful, right? And so I offer the kind of grace in my classes through a maternal pedagogy, which involves connecting heart, mind, spirit sort of work. To also, part of the intention is to empower them with that pedagogy so that they will also offer and show love and kindness to Indigenous students and all students in their classroom. I talked about teaching out of the same book that my grandmother's holding in that picture. I wish I knew what poem she was reading in that picture, but I teach some of the poems in my teacher ed class. And so one would be the song My Paddle Sings, which is a very famous Pauline Johnson poem. But the other one, which is my favorite poem, is A Cry from an Indian Wife. And so I get the students to, this is just one example, but I bring in a lot of poetry. I bring in Susan Dion's Braiding Histories work. But with those poems, I get them to sit with them and to reflect on them and to think about, again, connecting it back to Bell Hook's work on home place and Indigenous home place, but to think about what does it mean to imagine classrooms as safe spaces of resistance and renewal for all students in the classroom, right? And so by doing that in teacher ed, I hope that I'm providing them with the tools for them to bring that into their own classrooms.
Also, I think teachers have to be trained in Aboriginal, teachers have to be trained to teach Aboriginal courses in a classroom. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Teachers have to be trained. The ones that are finishing their 5-year BEd, I think they should be trained how to properly teach like land base and colonialism. What you're talking about, they have to know what they're teaching, and also they have to know some of the sacred things that go along with it, and also participate with the elders. That's what they have to know. And I hope that they someday start teaching Aboriginal courses at the last year level. So they're well prepared to go into the, when they're going into the mainstream schools, they're well prepared to teach those courses, I mean, those subjects.
Yes, thank you. And I fully agree, and I don't think one course, like right now it's one mandatory Indigenous content course in teacher ed, I don't think that's enough. And I don't think, you mentioned like there should be some universities like University of Winnipeg, I'm not sure here, but have rolled out a mandatory undergrad Indigenous content course. But one isn't enough, right? And so this knowledge needs to be scaffolded, and very much like you said, it also needs to involve elders and traditional knowledge keepers and land education, right? And so that takes multiple courses to do that.
Thank you. I just have one question. I've been listening to you, and you speak lots to the maternal instincts. Can you speak a little bit to how it's guided you on a journey and how it will guide researchers? Because maternal instincts are very protective, right? Like we all have that motherly instinct. So can you just speak to that a little bit about how it kind of guided you through your research and the pros and cons of it, of that maternal instinct?
Sure. So one thing that I share, and I did share, is that when I use the word maternal, it's very different from like a Western and patriarchal understanding of what maternal means. And so I also, when I talk about maternal, that for me, the understanding of maternal also involves egalitarian and kinship, right? And so I'm leaning towards kinship pedagogies now, but so there's a lot of pushback to the idea of nurturing being a natural instinct. So I also write about that as well, right? And so, but I think for myself, I look to teachings like, as a Haudenosaunee woman, I talk about, and the starting place for me is creation story and the teachings of Sky Woman, and one of our earliest single mothers, and even reframing the word single mother now to like a matriarchal mother, right? Women were head of the households, and right, there's a stigmatism to that word single mother. I know I'm moving past your question a little bit, but there's so many different pieces, right, in our creation stories where we see connections, whether it's connection to land, connection to territory, which I talked about. One of the quotations that I skipped over about Indigenous story work talks about how Indigenous story work connects us to Mother Earth, right? And so when we think about those different kind of connections, and by thinking about those connections, also really moving past what is like extractive to something that honors all of our relationships and our human and non-human kin, right? So honoring all life forms. So those are some of, I don't know if that answers your question, but those are kind of some of the teachings that are a starting place for me.
So it's clear to me, and by now it should be somewhat clear to people in the field, that some of the things that we think are important to explore in programs at universities in which Indigenous education, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous achievement are central, that this is still a relatively new area of concern for universities. There's a legacy for understanding at the community level, no doubt, but it's that bringing to bear those traditions, those knowledges in a way that can lead to change in universities like ours is why we're really proud that you've come to us to share your knowledge, share your work, and that you will continue, hopefully, to do your work for the betterment of Indigenous education across Canada. So I hope everybody will join me in thanking Jennifer Brant for sharing her lecture with us this evening. On behalf of the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Education, please accept this.
Thank you, Yahweh.
And Nyawagoa to everybody on Zoom and here in person today for joining us. It's not often we get opportunities these days to do this. We've done a lot on Zoom last year, a few, I guess. This is the first time we've attempted something in person. There's more to come in the future. And keep an eye on your email for those. So again, Nyawagoa, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the week.